We're going to talk about 5 ways to get the most from SharePoint, and specifically we're targeting, as you can tell from the room that we have today, for Upstream Oil and Gas. With Protechnics, we actually have a service company sort of represented, as well as woodproof gas turbines. If I can get that out of my mouth, all right. We have service company manufacturers, as well as on the asset side with the other folks in the room today. So we're going to talk about both sides of that. We're going to talk about how service companies and manufacturers and anyone who is selling to and into the oil and gas industry, as well as on the asset owner side today. We're going to talk about frack your data. We'll talk about what that is. We're going to talk about access to actionable insights. So what does this mean, and how does that impact our ability to do our job in the upstream world? We're going to talk about the 5 value drivers in upstream SharePoint. So what are 5 kind of baseline capabilities that SharePoint has, and how can they apply directly to the upstream world? We're going to kind of finish with some takeaways, and then we're going to have some examples and Q&A at the end. The examples are, if we have time for it, we'll, if we want to look at some visual kind of ideas of what's some ways you could lay out a SharePoint hierarchy, lay out a page, and maybe get a sense of, beyond just the basic install, what can SharePoint actually do. We'll show you some pictures of that as well. Okay, so just a little bit of background information about sort of why SharePoint. First of all, we have this kind of worldwide global driver of data proliferation. And what this means is that there's more and more information. In fact, the production of information itself is accelerating. The chairman of Google said that 90% of the world's data is constantly created in the last 2 years. Now, we are doubling our amount of data in the world every 2 years. And it's just a massive, massive thought to think about, where are we going to put all this stuff, and then how can we process it all as people are increasingly becoming information workers. And what I mean by information worker, I think about what are the tools that we use to accomplish our job. And frankly, it's information today, more so than it is tangible desks and equipment and wrenches and a can of oil and machinery. Those things still are there. It's how we interact with the physical world, but there's so much more work being done in information today that a lot of the field work becomes execution. In upstream, another trend is that there's an increasing amount of data being generated in operations, okay? Especially with unconventionals, what we see is that the amount of data, in terms of just volume and size, that's being produced by an upstream company, and then this is going to be in the asset side, but also in the service company side, right? You're taking a lot of this telemetry, measuring fluids, measuring chemical use, SCADA systems. They're producing way more data in the operations, the actually drilling, completion, production, and workover cycle of a well that wasn't necessarily there before in the conventional side of production, and also this mass transition into shale. And also the systems on the operational side of the business, in terms of from a technology perspective, are a generation behind where the systems on the G&G side, in terms of the ability to deal with this large amount of data. So what is this? So we use this term called frack your data. And frack your data, what do we mean by that? Okay, this is something that we sort of trademarked, and it's a way that we think of how do we get organizations to effectively share information, as some of you mentioned in your intros, what it is. So we've all seen a diagram like this, which is, we've got these different departments in our company, and they all have databases. And we have this set of users up here at the business that need access to that information. But how are we, what we think of is, okay, let's take an oil and gas analogy and overlay this and think of it as, we have some data, the data in the source rock, right? And the data is trapped by these sort of inefficient processes and inefficient tools to share that information to the organization. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to drill into that data, and we need to frack the data. In other words, allow the data to flow from these sort of trapped systems into the people who need to consume this information. And what we want to produce from that information is insight. We use the word insight very intentionally. It is literally sight in. It is visibility into what is going on versus just a lot of information noise. And I have to sort of reprocess that to understand what action I should take. So we actually have this sort of concept of this frac your data and how does information affect all of the different personas that we might see in an oil and gas company. We created an infographic which illustrates this, and we actually have these sort of some kind of larger format takeaways. This isn't a bat that I'm going to, come after you guys with, but we have some posters in the back if you would. Grab one of those on your way out if you'd like. But this poster basically goes through all the different personas from the COO, Director of Revenue Accounting, VP of Operations, and kind of shows how does the ability to access information affect each of those. One study done by Schlumberger and a consulting group out of the UK showed that 33% of the value creation activities in actual E&P assets is done by analysis of data. Okay, in other words, data management, the ability to effectively use information. If you look at what are the performance of an asset where that's done a poor job, and the performance of the similar asset where that's done a good job, what statistically, what is the actual impact of that ability to process information? And they said up to a third of the value in an asset could be directly related to the ability to consume that information. If we look at a typical E&P org chart and we think about how does information flow through this organization, typically information flows from the field to the back office. That's the general direction of information, right? We're looking at what's happening out in the field, or we're looking at a potential asset that we might want to go and develop, and it's flowing up the org chart, right? And it's becoming higher and higher levels of information. And then decisions get made, and communication is flowing down the org chart. It's flowing from the top, and what happens is that information gets filtered through the strategy of that company, right? It's the strategy of exploitation, or representing the type of risk reward that their investors want them to go after, and then the decisions get made, and that gets communicated down the org chart. And this cycle of analyze, decide, act, collect, this is sort of like the Edward Deming cycle of lean manufacturing concepts. Are you guys familiar with the Deming cycle? Right? He was lean manufacturing from Toyota. He was the guy that revolutionized this ability of continuous improvement. The idea that by iterative, right, as we go through this cycle, we learn and we create a new quality standard, and then we iterate again on that quality standard. And by doing that iteratively over time, we're always increasing our quality. And so, especially as we look at what does a shale operator look like, this iterative cycle of processing of information is really becoming the ability to improve quality, to drive down lifting costs, to drive down completion times, etc. All the things that we want to measure as we think about what is efficiency. And the last thing I want to say about this is that the value creation activities are up here. It's the time spent in analysis, where the humans really do the best job. Analysis, filtering that through strategy, and making decisions. And what we want to do as a company that helps other businesses with software is help them take their people time and move it from these activities, right, the doing and the collecting of information, and move it more towards the analysis and decision making, the value creation activities in a typical company. One comment in E&P Magazine last year said that we're like a factory that's producing wells. This is the analogy to the lean manufacturing concept. And those wells then are used to produce natural gas. Lean manufacturing relies on the comprehensive reporting, so this ability to access the information in a way that's consumable to the end user. You have to know where your problems are in order to avoid them, or at least respond quickly. So it's not only a reactive, this ability to respond to issues as they come up in the field or during an M&A transaction. It does not always coming directly from operations. When we think about some information bubbles up and then what do we do with it, how soon can we then react and cause change in the organization to respond to that, but also to proactively avoid issues. Right? So if we're ahead of the issue and we have the information and we're ability to sort of sidestep a problem, that's an even bigger impact that we'd be able to make. Both of them rely on information. So that's sort of the information backdrop. But how does SharePoint then enable excellence for this well factory of tomorrow, right? And even on the service company side, they're contributing to the sort of iterative asset development strategy that is most common today? Well, we think about SharePoint as a platform for managing all the information related to a company's business, okay, as a central hub of information that you can then use to consume and make decisions, to spend more time on the analysis and the decision-making process and less time on gathering the data that you need, processing it so that you can actually do the analysis. So we think about the life cycle of an asset, right? Now this is specifically talking about the E&P side, but if you think about it, we're producing all sorts of different content along there. Videos, surveys, logs, seismic, documents, checklists, safety analysis, regulatory data. I mean, you could go on and on. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into specific. But underlying this, we have sort of the back office of a company, right, as well. Accounting, forecasting, compliance, regulatory, safety. These are all sort of back office functions that are always running across this entire asset lifecycle. And we think about SharePoint as a place to gather all this, which today, as we saw in that kind of frac your data graph, it's scattered throughout the organization. The drilling folks have their data, production has their data, E&P, G&G has their data, but across 15 different systems. Sometimes they're linked together, sometimes they're not. Safety is a very new but top of mind focus for oil and gas companies, and they're trying to retool how do we build safety into this whole process rather than it just being a layer that sits on top. All of that, again, driven by information. So what's the impact? We think about the impact, and this actually comes from another Schlumberger study where they looked at what is the ability to have quality data, how does that impact how our people spend their time? So we think about data that's hard to find, it's in the wrong format, it's in systems that I don't have access to, it's too much data when I just need a little bit, it's only a little bit when I need a lot, there's no trend, there's no secondary information, there's no metadata, it's not searchable, I have to browse for it, all of these things, right? Think about how did people spend their time? Well, they spend more than half of their time identifying what the information is that they need, another 25% of their time preparing the data for analysis, and you only really get to spend about 20% of your time actually analyzing data so that you can arrive at a decision. And hopefully the decision is the step change for the business. That's when you actually make a change that creates value for the organization, is when you make a human decision. The data itself is not actually creating value for the organization, it's the people. So that's really where we have the value creation. We think about when you have access to actionable information, so information that's presented in a way that is much closer to being prepared to actually make a decision, then you spend the vast majority of your time in the analysis and decision side and not so much in the prepare and identify side. And so that's really what we think about, is how do we minimize this non-productive time for our very expensive, very hard to get, hard to keep, right? These information workers, the scientists, the people with lots and lots of tenure and experience, and how do we impact their time? So this is where SharePoint fits in. The 5 key value drivers here. Now these are pieces of the SharePoint platform that by themselves don't really do anything. So I want to be clear about that. If you just installed SharePoint, you said, okay, here you go, this is a solution. It's our perspective that it's not a solution out of the box. In fact, does it have the capability to be a solution? Yes. But we think of it like a toolbox of raw materials. It's a set of Lego building blocks that's sitting in the box in sort of disjoint as they come. It doesn't look like anything. It doesn't look like anything I could use. But if you know how to assemble them properly, you can actually create something that looks a lot like a productive tool. We're going to talk about 5 things in the SharePoint world and how they create value for upstream companies. Number 1, document management. This is the ability to find the content, okay? Number 2, forms and lists. The impact here is a time savings and an error reduction. We'll talk about that a little more specifically. Workflows, tracking and traceability. So tracking is where is this process at? Traceability is kind of where has it been. It's the idea of tracing a process through the steps and seeing who's touched this along the way. Dashboards, this is about putting information in context with other information, and we'll show you some pictures of that, what that looks like. And then branding, which is how to drive that corporate identity. We're seeing, it used to be the mentality, oil companies don't have customers, and so we don't need anything more than a logo. and the idea that we don't have to brand, we don't have to market, we don't have to communicate because we sell a commodity at the end of the day. But nowadays, with the competition for staff, competition for asset activity, you know, I think what we're seeing is a big shift. You're starting to see marketing departments come to life. I don't mean gas marketing. I mean marketing as in communications, not only internal but also external, coming and being much more of a focus. So document management. The value here is that information is easier to organize. Some of you folks mentioned that you have SharePoint today. Do you find that it allows you to access information easier? Somewhat. So you could see that it could potentially at least offer that if it maybe were done a little differently or designed with that in mind. Okay. This idea of search versus browse. So everyone knows how fast it is to find information when you just go to Google, type in a word, and say go, and out comes the top 3 probably has your answer, right? So SharePoint, the goal is, when it's properly done, is to provide that same experience in all of your data in your organization. So to make it all searchable, indexed, so that you can type in what it is that you're looking for, and it comes back with this intelligent result, so that you're not browsing, clicking through folders. Think about this mess of files and folders, paper room, you know, your Z drive with 18 folders deep, and then 4 copies of the spreadsheet. I mean, everyone can appreciate that, and trying to navigate and find the information you need. Oh, it was in someone's email. It wasn't actually on the file share. So you think about where we put information today, we stash it all over the place. SharePoint gives us this ability to put it in one place and then have searchability. Better controls for folks that are kind of in the, you know, need that audit and that control, especially around sensitive information. And passive awareness. This is the ability that I don't have to go and check to see if there's a new version available. I can just say, hey, alert me whenever this document changes, or alert me when anything in this folder changes. So as a passive awareness, I don't spend the time checking, say, hey, did you update that? Hey, did you set that presentation up yet? Hey, did you add that slide yet? You don't have to do all that communication. You just say, I just want to be passively aware of these types of changes to documents, and think about the time savings that comes there. So what are some things that we see upstream companies store in SharePoint? I kind of just made this sort of a simple grid here. Records, those are things, documents that don't tend to change once they're created. And then what we call documents, these things are alive, right? Documents that get edited, Word documents, things like that. And I also think about them as corporates, things at the company level, then things at the project level, and then things at the sort of or asset team level. And of course, hierarchies can change. Every company has sort of a different idea of what a hierarchy could be, but you can think about these types of documents, and I'm sure each of you in the room can see documents that you work with every day there and saying, wow, you can put those in SharePoint, and there really are ways to track those more effectively. Next is lists and forms. This is for structured information. So this is information that has an order or has multiple fields. So think about lists that you would keep in a spreadsheet perhaps today. Vendor lists. We've seen oil and gas companies that keep contract lists in Excel on a network drive, or a list of vendors that they can buy mud services from, or a list of AFEs in a spreadsheet, or an AFE itself in a spreadsheet. You think about all these things that end up in email and in spreadsheets and on network drives, and these lists and forms have the ability to create a structured way to input information, which means you can control the format. You can say this number has to be a date and it has to be between these things, and then you can tie those to workflows so that form goes through an approval process. And we'll talk about workflows a little more after that. So what are some of the lists and forms we can track? A list of rigs that are drilling, a list of vendors, regulatory checklists, lots of other types of checklists, due diligence checklists for deals around M&A, forms, safety forms, contractor forms, operational checklists, purchase order request forms. These are all the different types of forms that you can also implement and get out of paper. Next, workflows. We mentioned this a little bit, but this is the ability to automate the process, to track the process, and to have traceability, or sort of the history information into that process, so that you know where has it been, where's the bottleneck. what's waiting on me? What's waiting on my? This is something we use internally for when a vendor invoice comes in, it goes through an approval workflow, and I can go and see what are all the things that are waiting on me and just go approve, 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 approve. Also review. Think about review and approvals as kind of your simplest of workflows, but you can imagine also much more complicated workflows like a regulatory approval process, you know, where you have to get this approved first and then you file for this permit and then you have to do this survey, and you want to know like where is an asset along that process. It can give you a way to track that through it. And these workflows can be tied to documents, they can be tied to sets of documents, and they can be tied to forms and list items. So all of the things we just talked about, you can then put through these workflows as well. Dashboards. I'm going to show you some examples of dashboards, but the idea here is context. Context is this information next to other information such that the combination gives me better insight into what's going on. So this might be a list, maybe it shows me my net production, net and gross production, gas, oil, and water for the last rolling 90 days, as well as a rig count operating with status information. So I might say, well, why is this down? Oh, it's because of that. I see a red flag over here, and I know this is where I should spend some time examining what might be going on if there's an action I need to take. Okay? And also, dashboards give you this idea of showing high-level information, just like in your car, right? You see that check engine light come on. It's not telling you the detailed information of what's wrong. It just says, hey, you need to spend some time examining what's behind this light. So the same thing about dashboards for the business. It's about showing the high-level information, which gives you insight into where you should examine or spend that analysis time. You can filter them, you can drill through, and there's all sorts of different ways to drill through. Typical Gulf of Mexico hierarchy there, area block, lease well completion, company field well. You think about hierarchical information and dashboards that give you details at each of those levels so that you can quickly filter and sort. All types of different information that you might want to see. Financial variance information, LOE versus budget versus actual. Timeline visualization, what's your development schedule for this field? Looking at rig timelines, right? And as you go through a drilling program, public financial data, stock tickers, commodity prices, things like that. Other types of data you might see, maps. You see maps becoming much more common, not just in the G&G world, but also into operations and management as well, visualizing that data geographically. Last is branding. Branding is the ability to drive user adoption, and branding is sort of putting your corporate voice on the user experience. Now, why would we spend money in branding? As we talked about, it helps people, it helps to drive the communication of the company internally. Just like we brand our public website, a lot of companies will brand their public website, but they don't brand their internal website. You know, when we think about the way that the energy business is changing over time, and what the trend that we're seeing is a lot more interest in carrying the brand through internally to give people a seamless experience. Any of you guys that have SharePoint today, is your SharePoint experience branded? So you may, and then you have sort of logos and colors, or do you have like a fully kind of immersive experience? You're like, wow, I forget it's SharePoint sometimes. Logos and colors, right. So branding in SharePoint is another thing where you have a spectrum of capabilities, right? You could start with logos and colors, you could put an actual template in place, and then you could brand everything from dialog boxes to checklists to drop-down lists. You can really go crazy with it if you wanted to have a fully branded experience. So we talked about there's different levels of branding here, simple, moderate, and complex branding. The most complex is actually using SharePoint for your public site, which is also a possibility, although not as common as using it for the internal site. The biggest ROI that we see from branding is the uptake from the user community is much higher because it feels like their site versus some tool that they need to get trained in. It's, oh, this is a website made for me. And when you have that experience, like this was made for me, there's just like an instant attraction to it. It's like the curiosity is piqued. It's like, oh, I wonder what this graph does. I wonder oh, look, here's oh, they're all sorted. How nice. I can actually just go, this is one place. This has everything I need in it. And that's really what you want to deliver to them. So the takeaways are, in summary here, upstream companies need access to actual insight. And this is because of this loop, right? This analysis loop, and we want to spend our human time in the analyze and decide phase and not in the collect data phase. SharePoint can surface the right information for the right people at the right time in the right format in the right context. So that's really where we want to be is taking that. You get any of those wrong, then there's more work on the humans, the information workers, to go pre-process before they can actually analyze and decide. And that's really what we're trying to do. And lastly is that customization is key. So, you know, all of this, if you've seen SharePoint sort of out of the box, again, it has the building blocks to become and be a solution, but it is definitely not, at least in our view, a solution itself. In other words, what problem does it solve is a small subset of what it actually can solve out of the box versus something that's customized and built on the SharePoint platform. So any questions about takeaways or any of the five drivers? Okay, great. So last I just want to cover, and then we'll kind of just open it up for discussion and lunch, but what does SharePoint look like for Upstream? What can it look like? So here's some examples. I'm going to show a combination of some wireframes and some actually built out sites so that you can get a sense of what does it look like to conceptualize the SharePoint portal, as well as what can one look like when it's branded. So here's an example of kind of a home page showing some production numbers, showing some stock, showing some production trends, and this is all mocked up data, not actual data. So there's no confidentiality issues here, but we try to sort of blur things when we can. But it's all mocked up data, actually from multiple different projects sort of pulled in together. But you can get a sense of, here's a production trend, right, on a log graph. Here's some public data, oil and gas prices, some high level production, and also some safety. Here's some lost time accident type information, sort of on the home page. Here's another example. So maybe when we want to look at operationally, we want to look at data on a map, and then when we want the ability to sort of click and look at some high level details on that particular property and understand, maybe see a picture, maybe understand some KPIs sort of at a high level for that well. You know, what's the average production? Is that meeting expectations? Where are we with respect to budget? And then you have a link you can sort of drill in even more detail. Here you can see some filtering type information and be able to sort of drill in and see different types of leases, prospects, development areas. You know, how do you want to filter that view on the map? Here you could look at some revenues. You can look at gas sales number, NGLs, net oil production, reported versus planned. Right, so you have some budgetary guidelines. Here's distribution across leases of production. Again, safety, and some estimated cost versus actual. So here's some financial on the cost side as opposed to the revenue side. Here's an example in the drilling area. You can see your drilling schedule here. Here's a rig schedule. You know, what rig is doing which activities at what time. Some drilling cost data and some quick links to other types of reports. So this is, again, data in context, right? You've got some unstructured data, your documents, your daily drilling report, for example, along with some rig schedule and overall what's your development plan looking at. You put that all together and you can get a quick at-a-glance picture of where should I spend my day today if I'm management. And then here's some example of kind of branded SharePoint. So you can actually put a corporate branded face with iconography, with menus that make it more intuitive, that make the search more friendly, make it easy to find information so that your business's fonts and brand comes through. Here's another example of an internal store on the HR side. You will look at an employee center, understand what types of news items are coming out about the company, internal corporate communications, access to your benefits, right, all the back office pieces. And then here's another example of You've got some ethics data. This company chose to sort of highlight that information, notifications, time and weather, you know, maybe not super useful, but some people find, you know, that's got to be on the home page. And then, you know, common activities. If you looked at corporate travel arrangements, safety, finances, benefits, policies, so forth. So you can really put all that in front of people. So hopefully we've had a chance to talk through today what SharePoint can be, why is keeping up with this information so important in the upstream world, and then what are 5 capabilities of SharePoint that can create the most value for in the upstream area.